June 3rd, 1945, 15:20 hours, Hampshire, England. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parade ground. 58 women stood in formation, their backs straight despite exhaustion, their faces carefully blank. They had been standing for 90 minutes, waiting. In front of them, 3 German officers, former Oberführerinnen from the Auxiliary Corps, paced back and forth, inspecting the ranks with the same cold efficiency they had maintained throughout the war. One of them stopped in front of a young woman, Clara, 23, a former radio operator from Stuttgart. The officer leaned in, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Your buttons are tarnished. This is unacceptable. You dishonour the uniform." Clara stared straight ahead, said nothing. The officer raised her hand, then a voice, British, calm, carrying authority, cut across the parade ground. "That's enough." A British major appeared, walking with measured steps. Behind him, 2 corporals. The major stopped between the German officer and Clara. "Step back, please." The German officer turned, her face flushed with indignation. "These women are under my command. I am maintaining discipline." The major's expression did not change. "Not anymore. As of 1300 hours today, all prisoners of war are under British military jurisdiction. You are a prisoner, just as they are. You have no authority here." Silence, the kind that changes everything. The German officer opened her mouth, closed it, stepped back. The major looked at Clara. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. He nodded. "Formation dismissed. Return to quarters." The women stood frozen for a moment, uncertain. Then, slowly, they broke ranks. Clara walked back to the barracks on legs that barely held her, and when she reached her cot, she sat down and wept. Not from pain, from disbelief. She had spent 3 years fearing the enemy. She had never expected to be protected by them. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe. The next will surprise you even more. They had been auxiliaries, Luftwaffenhelferinnen and Nachrichtenhelferinnen, women who had operated radios, plotted aircraft movements, staffed communication centres, and kept the machinery of the German military functioning even as that machinery collapsed around them. They had not flown planes or fired weapons, but they had worn uniforms, sworn oaths, and served a regime that was now rubble and recrimination. Clara had joined in 1942 at 19 because her school had presented it as patriotic duty. They trained her in Morse code and stationed her at a signals post near Frankfurt. For 2 years she transmitted messages she did not fully understand, routing communications between units whose locations kept changing, their numbers dwindling. By April 1945 the signals post was abandoned, the equipment destroyed, and Clara was swept up in the mass surrenders that followed Germany's collapse. She had been transported west with 200 other women, herded onto trucks by British soldiers who had been efficient but not cruel. The journey had taken 4 days, trucks, then trains, then a ship across the Channel. Throughout it all, the former German officers had maintained their authority, organising the women, issuing orders, enforcing the discipline that had defined their service. Until today. Until a British major had said, "You have no authority here." The camp in Hampshire was a converted country estate, requisitioned for the duration and transformed into a detention facility. The main house served as administration. The women were housed in wooden barracks built in the gardens. A fence surrounded the compound, but there were no guard towers, no barbed wire, just a gate, guards and rules. On the first day, the British commandant, a colonel with grey hair and measured speech, had addressed them in the estate's great hall. "You are prisoners of war under British custody. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will be fed. You will follow regulations. Former ranks are not recognised. You are all equal here. Do you understand?" The former officers had bristled. The enlisted women had exchanged uncertain glances. Clara had thought, equal. What does that even mean? The journey to England had been strange. The trucks had been uncomfortable, but not brutal. The guards had been distant, but not aggressive. At one stop, a British corporal had distributed water and hard biscuits. When one of the former officers had tried to organise the distribution, the corporal had ignored her and handed supplies directly to the nearest women. The ship crossing had been rough. Clara had spent most of it below deck, fighting nausea, pressed against dozens of other women in a space that smelled of diesel and fear. When they docked at Southampton, she had climbed onto the deck and breathed air that tasted of salt and something else. Freedom maybe, though she was still a prisoner. The train through the English countryside had been surreal. Clara had watched fields and villages slide past, green, intact, untouched by war. She had thought, this is what survival looks like. The camp had appeared in late afternoon, the estate house golden in the slanting light. The women had disembarked, formed ranks automatically, and waited while British officers processed paperwork. One of the former German officers, a stern woman named Oberführerin Schneider, had tried to maintain control, issuing orders, directing formations. The British had allowed it at first because it simplified logistics, but that had ended today. After the confrontation on the parade ground, Clara returned to her barracks and found the other women in various states of shock, relief, and confusion. The former officers had retreated to their own quarters. They were still housed separately, though that would change soon. The enlisted women sat on their cots, processing what had just happened. "Did you see her face?" one woman whispered. "Schneider's face when the British major told her she had no authority?" "I thought she was going to explode," another said. Clara sat on her cot and realised her hands were shaking. A woman named Erica, older, steady, a former clerk from Munich, sat beside her. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," Clara said. I thought when she raised her hand." "I know." The British officer stopped her. "Why?" Erica was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because the rules here are different." The first real act of protection had come that evening. The women were called to the mess hall for supper. They filed in, uncertain, and found long tables laid with tin plates and cups. British soldiers served food, stew, bread, tea, not luxurious but substantial. The former officers entered last, expecting their usual separate table, their slightly better portions. They found none. A British sergeant directed them to sit with the others. "All prisoners eat together," he said in halting German. "No special treatment." Oberführerin Schneider drew herself up. "I am an officer. I require—" The sergeant cut her off. "You were an officer. Now you're a prisoner. Same as them. Sit." She sat, stiffly, furiously. But she sat. Clara watched this from across the room and felt something shift inside her chest. They will not let her hurt us anymore. They will not let any of them hurt us. "They fed us at the same table," she wrote later in a diary she kept on scraps of paper. "The officers who had commanded us for years were made equal. The British did this. I don't understand why, but they did." The system that governed this equality was not sentiment. It was policy, rooted in the Geneva Conventions, codified in British military law, and enforced by officers who understood that rank among prisoners was a complication at best, a tool for continued abuse at worst. A directive from the War Office in 1943 had clarified, "Former enemy ranks are not recognised within POW camps. All prisoners are to be treated equally, regardless of their prior position." The logic was threefold. Security. Eliminating internal hierarchies reduced the potential for coercion, intimidation, and organised resistance. Diplomacy. Equal treatment aligned with international law and demonstrated British commitment to humane standards. Morality. Because allowing former officers to maintain authority meant allowing the structures of oppression to continue even in captivity. It was not perfect. There were camps where former ranks persisted informally, where officers still commanded respect or fear. But in most places, the policy held. Former generals worked alongside former privates. Former officers ate the same food, slept in the same barracks, followed the same rules. And in Hampshire, that meant Oberführerin Schneider had no more authority than Clara. The days found a rhythm. Mornings began with roll call, names read from a roster, no saluting, no ranks. Then breakfast, porridge, toast, tea. Simple food, but consistent. The women learned to trust it would be there tomorrow. After breakfast, work assignments. The camp needed labour. Kitchen, laundry, gardens, maintenance. The British assigned work without regard for former position. Schneider, who had once commanded 200 women, was assigned to the kitchen. Clara, who had never commanded anyone, was assigned to the garden alongside a former Hauptgefreiter who had once outranked her significantly. They worked side by side, planting vegetables, and neither mentioned their former ranks. What would be the point? The British Guards supervised but did not hover. They checked in periodically, asked if anyone needed supplies, and left the women to their tasks. One guard, a corporal named Jenkins, Welsh with a dry sense of humour, showed Clara how to identify weeds versus seedlings. This one stays, this one goes, simple as that. It was the first time in 3 years anyone had taught her something without making her feel inadequate for not already knowing it. One afternoon, Clara was assigned to the laundry with 3 other women, including a former officer named Frau Vogel. They worked in silence, scrubbing uniforms in great tubs of hot water. The work was hard, equalising. Your former rank meant nothing to the laundry. Frau Vogel struggled with the heavy fabrics. She had been an administrator, not accustomed to physical labour. Her hands were soft, blistering quickly. She tried to hide it, but Clara noticed. A British sergeant entered, older with a medical armband. He saw Frau Vogel's hands and frowned. "Let me see those." She hesitated. He waited patiently. Finally, she showed him. He examined the blisters and nodded. "Right, come with me." He led her to the medical station, treated her hands, gave her gloves for the work. Then he brought her back. "Use the gloves. No sense letting your hands get infected." Frau Vogel thanked him quietly. Later, she said to Clara, "He didn't care that I was an officer. He just cared that my hands were injured." "Yes," Clara said, "that's how it works here." "The British don't see ranks," Clara wrote. "They see people. I'm still adjusting to that." In July, the Red Cross postal system began operating. Letters could be sent and received. Clara wrote to her mother her first communication in 4 months. She told her mother she was safe, that she was in England, that the British were treating her fairly. Her mother's reply arrived 6 weeks later. It was brief. "I'm glad you're alive. Your father is missing. I don't know where he is. Stay safe." Clara read the letter 3 times and then sat on her cot and cried. Erica sat beside her and said nothing, just placed a hand on her shoulder. They sat like that for 20 minutes. A British guard passed, saw Clara crying and paused. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just said, quietly, "I'm sorry, miss." Then he continued his patrol. That small acknowledgement, "I see your pain," meant more than Clara could express. One evening, Schneider tried to reassert control. She called several of the younger women aside and began issuing instructions about behaviour, about maintaining discipline, about not fraternising with the British. A British lieutenant overheard. He stepped in. "What's going on here?" Schneider straightened. "I am organising these women. They need guidance. They need to follow camp regulations," the lieutenant said. "Not your orders. You're a prisoner, same as them. If you continue to try to exercise authority, you'll be placed in isolation. Clear?" Schneider's face went white. "You cannot!" "I can, and I will. This is your only warning." He walked away. Schneider stood there, trembling with rage and humiliation. The younger women quietly dispersed. That night, Clara thought, "The British protect us, even from our own." If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The transformation was gradual. The women had spent years in a hierarchy that defined their worth by their rank, their obedience, their place in the structure. Now that structure was gone, and they were learning to exist without it. Clara noticed small changes. Women who had once been officers and enlisted personnel now spoke as equals. They shared work, shared meals, shared the small kindnesses that made camp life bearable. The fear that had defined their relationships, the fear of punishment, of being reported, of stepping out of line, slowly evaporated. In its place, a tentative camaraderie. They were all prisoners. They were all far from home. They were all trying to survive. And the British, by refusing to recognise their former ranks, had made that survival possible. In August, the camp held a small gathering to mark the end of the war in the Pacific. It was subdued. No grand celebration, just a meal slightly better than usual and a chaplain who offered a prayer for peace. Clara attended. She was not religious, but it felt important to mark the moment. The chaplain, an Anglican priest with a gentle voice, spoke about reconciliation, about how the hardest part of peace was learning to see former enemies as people. Clara thought, "The British have already done that. They saw us as people from the start." After the service, the chaplain approached her. "How are you managing?" he asked in careful German. She thought about lying. Instead, she said, "I'm learning to live without fear." He nodded. "That's no small thing." "No," she said, "it's not." Repatriation began in September. The women were called in groups, processed, given papers, sent back to Germany or to displaced persons camps if they had nowhere to go. Clara was in the third group. She packed her small bundle: a comb, a bar of soap, the diary written on scraps of paper. Corporal Jenkins gave her a packet of seeds on the morning she left. "Carrots," he said, "for wherever you end up. Everyone needs a garden." She took the seeds. "Thank you for everything." He shrugged. "Just treated you like people. Shouldn't be remarkable, but I suppose it is." She thought. It was remarkable. It changed everything. Clara found her mother in October 1945 in a displaced persons camp near Stuttgart. They held each other and cried and did not speak for a long time. Her father was never found. Clara stayed in Germany. She worked as a translator, then as a clerk in a school. She married in 1953, a carpenter, kind and steady, and had 2 children. She planted a garden every spring. Carrots, always carrots. She never spoke about the war, but every time she saw someone use authority to intimidate, she thought about the British major who had stepped between Schneider and a frightened young woman and said, "That's enough." She kept Corporal Jenkins' packet, empty now, the seeds long planted, in a drawer beside her bed. In 1988, Clara returned to England. She took a train to Hampshire and found the old estate, still standing, converted into a conference centre. She walked through the grounds where the barracks had been, where the gardens had stretched, where she had first learned that protection could come from unexpected places. She stood where the parade ground had been and thought, "This is where I learned that civilization meant protecting the weak from the powerful, even when the powerful were your own people." She didn't go inside. She just stood there, remembering the major who had intervened, the corporal who had given her seeds, the system that had refused to let former officers continue their cruelty. Then she left. The German officer had raised her hand. The women had braced for the blow they had learned to expect. Then a British voice had said, "That's enough," and everything had changed. If this story reminded you that history is written in gestures as much as battles, subscribe. You'll find more truths here than in any textbook. In 2002, Clara died peacefully in her sleep. Her children found a box in her closet, letters, photographs, and an empty seed packet carefully wrapped in cloth. One letter, written but never sent, was addressed to the British major whose name she had never learned. It said, in careful English, "You stepped between me and harm. You protected me from my own commanders. You showed me that power could be used for protection, not oppression. Thank you." The children could not deliver the letter, but they kept it anyway because some gratitude transcends time and distance. It just needs to exist. The afternoon sun had cast long shadows across the parade ground. The women had stood in formation, waiting. The German officer had raised her hand. Then a British voice had said, "That's enough," and the hand had lowered. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy. And mercy, they learned, was not the absence of authority. It was authority wielded for protection rather than harm. A major who intervened, a system that refused to recognize oppressive hierarchies, a civilization that insisted, "Former ranks mean nothing here. You are all equal." That was the measure of decency. Not the absence of rules, but rules that protected the vulnerable. Not the elimination of power, but power exercised with restraint. Not the grand gesture, but the quiet moment when someone steps between you and harm and says simply, "That's enough." The war had ended. But the lesson remained, that civilization was built in small acts of protection, repeated daily until they became structure. Until they became normal, until they became the only way forward.